There are millions of different forms of life on our planet. This is only a tiny sample. How did such a variety of life come into being? The theory of evolution doesn't attempt to explain how life itself arose, but it does claim that life first appeared in very simple forms, which over millions of years gradually changed into more and more complex and diverse living creatures. This video will show you some of the main pieces of evidence upon which the theory of evolution is based. Some of the most important evidence comes from fossils. In many parts of the world, we find the shapes of animals and plants preserved in solid rock. Some are obviously similar to forms of life we see today, but others are like nothing alive today. These are all fossils. How did they get there? Fossils are found in sedimentary rocks. Rocks formed from deposits of sand or mud laid down on the land, in lakes, or under the sea in times past. The dead remains of plants and animals become covered by more sediments. Over millions of years, the weight of new sediments accumulating above compresses the sediments into rocks. Minerals in the water contained in the sediments percolate into the dead remains, turning them into rock, a fossil. Sometimes animals are not preserved, but traces of their activities are. These are the fossilized footprints of a dinosaur. And these, the traces left by mollusks. When sedimentary rocks are formed, the sediments build up so that the rocks at the bottom are the oldest, and those at the top are the youngest. Here in the Grand Canyon, the sedimentary rocks are over a mile thick, about 1.5 kilometers. They are deeply dissected by the Colorado River. The rocks at the bottom of the canyon are almost 2,000 million years old. Some of the oldest known fossils come from rocks near Lake Superior in Canada. They are microscopic forms of blue-green algae, a very primitive form of life. As we look at younger and younger rocks, we find that the variety of fossils increases, and the life forms they represent become more complex. They progress from simple creatures like jellyfish and flatworms to crustaceans, fish, reptiles and mammals. So, the fossil record shows a gradual change in life forms over a long period of time, from simple to more complex forms. Many of these changes are very gradual. For example, the chalk rocks of this cliff on the south coast of the British Isles contain fossils of sea urchins. If we collect fossils at different levels in the cliff, we find that they change as the rocks become younger. Here is the youngest one compared with the oldest. These skeletons have been reconstructed from fossil bones. They show a series of horse-like mammals. And here are some models of what these animals might have looked like. This is a small leaf-eating mammal which lived 50 million years ago in North America. It had 4 toes on its front feet and 3 on the back. And this is another ancestor of the horse from more recent rocks. Its legs are longer, partly because the foot is raised so that the animal now walks on its toes. Most of the body weight is carried on the middle toe alone. The side toes barely touch the ground. In even younger rocks, we find fossils of horses with hooves. The continuously growing nail on the middle toe has become thick to reduce wear, forming a hoof. There's less foot area to cause friction with the ground, so the animal can run very fast. The newly evolved horses spread right across the northern hemisphere and down into Africa. This change in form made possible new lifestyles. Hoofed mammals like these can gallop at speeds of up to 65 kilometers or 40 miles an hour. Not only can they escape from predators, but they can also travel long distances to find grazing. This allows them to live in dry climates where they follow the rains in search of food and water. So, a change in anatomy can make it possible for an animal to colonize new areas and adopt new lifestyles. As we shall see later, this is an important driving force in evolution. Today, the horses have diversified still further. There are zebras, wild horses, donkeys, mules, and the whole range of breeds of domesticated horses. But the fossil record is not complete. Only certain forms of life and certain parts of animals are found as fossils, as the fate of this dead fish shows. The softer parts don't usually survive long enough to be buried. They're removed by scavengers or rotted by microorganisms before they can be preserved. So, our fossil record contains mainly skeletons and shells. Only occasionally is burial so rapid that flesh and skin and soft-bodied creatures can become fossilized. And there are many creatures which live in areas where sediments seldom accumulate quickly, so they leave no traces of their existence at all. We can only piece together the story of evolution as best we can from the clues we have. Some forms of life appear to die out completely. We say they become extinct. This creates gaps in the record. For instance, in rocks younger than about 64 million years, there are no dinosaur fossils. It seems that the dinosaurs died out over a relatively short period of geological time. Shortly after the extinction of the dinosaurs, fossils of mammals start to become more abundant in the fossil record. Presumably, the disappearance of the dinosaurs reduced competition for the available food, and the mammals were able to multiply and diversify to take their place. But why should creatures become extinct? The record of the rocks also tells about ancient climates. For example, the grains of sand that make up these ancient rocks in the British Isles have the same shape and composition as those of hot desert sand dunes near the equator, indicating that 270 million years ago, the British Isles had a desert climate. Coal seams found in the north of Scotland must have been formed in semi-tropical swamps, similar to those of the present-day Everglades in Florida, a very different climate from Scotland today. There's growing evidence that the reason for these large climatic changes is that the continents haven't always been in their present position on the globe. 300 million years ago, the map of the world would have looked rather like this. Gradually, the continents have drifted to their present positions. Today, animals and plants are becoming extinct for very similar reasons. Some can't cope with the changing climate. Others are losing their natural habitat because of the actions of a recently evolved new species, ourselves. The fossil record may be incomplete, but there's plenty of evidence for evolution in plants and animals alive today. Much of this evidence comes from the study of comparative anatomy, the comparison of the structure and form of living things. When the body structures of two different animals have a similar form, we say they're homologous. If we look at the forelimbs of the vertebrates, the animals with backbones, we find that they contain the same bones arranged in the same pattern, although the outward appearance of the limbs is very different. Let's take a closer look at the reptiles. The arm is made up of a thick, strong bone, the humerus, joined at the elbow to two smaller bones, the ulna and radius. Then come the wrist bones and the fingers, or digits. The sea lion has modified forelimbs which act as paddles for swimming, but the bones underneath are not very different from those of the reptiles. The horse's limbs are designed for walking and running. And the bird's limbs are designed for flying. The bones of the wrist and hand are fused to give extra support. The fingers are much reduced. Only the second and third ones support the wing, the radius and ulna taking the rest of the strain. In the bat wing, the wrist bones are greatly reduced, and the fingers are spread out to support the wing membrane. This kind of evolution, where the same basic structures have become altered to several different forms for a variety of functions, is called divergent evolution. The opposite kind of evidence for evolution comes from analogous structures, where similar organs have arisen from different parts of the body in different animals. Compare the bat's wings with those of insects. The butterfly wing is supported only by the veins running through it, and the membrane, which makes up the wing itself, is only 2 cells thick. The bat's wing is supported by an internal skeleton of bone, and the membrane is made up of layers of muscle and skin many cells thick. In certain animals, we can find traces of evolutionary changes, structures which in the past had a function, but today no longer serve any purpose. The snakes are descended from lizard-like reptiles whose legs became progressively reduced in size. In this snake, 2 tiny pegs are all that evolution has left of the original legs. Such structures are called vestigial structures. Many animals which live in dark caves over millions of generations have lost the use of their eyes, which serve no useful purpose in the dark. Only vestigial eyes remain in this blind cave fish. Another line of evidence comes from the study of embryos. Here you see the embryos of 4 different vertebrate animals. Can you guess what they'll become? The similarity in the structure of the early embryos of these vertebrates suggests that they have evolved from similar ancestors. In the distant past, they may even have shared a common ancestor. Evolution works at an even lower level of organization. Proteins are made up of long chains of chemical compounds called amino acids. 26 different amino acids are known to occur in proteins. The order of the amino acids determines the nature and function of a protein. If we compare the first 35 amino acids of a protein common to almost all cells, cytochrome C, we find that much of the sequence is the same in a wide range of animals and plants. This is human cytochrome C. And these sequences are from the chimpanzee and the rhesus monkey. The sequence is identical. Chimpanzees and monkeys are closely related to man. The horse, which is less closely related, shows 3 differences in the sequence. And similarly, the chicken. The more distantly related the organisms are to man, the more their cytochrome C differs. This is from the bullfrog, and this from the fruit fly. The silk moth scores 10 differences, And wheat, a plant, 13. Yeast, a primitive form of life, shows a grand total of 14 differences. More evidence comes from the geographical distribution of species. In Africa today, large flightless birds, the ostriches, roam the grasslands. Their wings have become reduced in size and they can no longer fly. This is Australia, and these birds are emus, very similar in appearance and body plan. And this is South America, and these are rheas, another related group of flightless birds. Until a few centuries ago, an even larger flightless bird, the elephant bird, lived in Madagascar. And just a few thousand years ago, the largest of them all, the giant moa, still lived in New Zealand. If we look at the distribution of these birds today, the rhea, the ostrich, the elephant bird, the emu, and the giant moa, we see that they're found only in the southern hemisphere, and they're widely separated. But if the ancestor of these birds was flightless, it could not have flown across the oceans to all these places. If we go back 130 million years, the continents were not in their present places. They were clustered in two great land masses, Gondwanaland in the south and Laurasia in the north, separated by the ancient Tethys Ocean. The ancestor of these birds arose in the southern continent of Gondwanaland, which explains why there are no such birds in Europe and North America. As the continents broke up and drifted apart, the different groups of birds became isolated, then evolved along slightly different lines in different places. Finally, we can even learn about evolution by studying the behavior of living organisms. This duck is courting. Notice the head-tipping movements in the display, thought to be derived from drinking actions. But these ducks are a completely different species. Notice the similarity in the display. And how about these grebes? The signs of evolution are all around us, if we know what to look for. In 1809, the year that Charles Darwin was born, the French biologist Lamarck proposed a hypothesis to account for evolution. He suggested that if certain parts of an animal were used a lot, like the legs and tail of a kangaroo, they became bigger and stronger, while parts that were not used became smaller and weaker, rather like muscles wither if a limb is not used. Changes that occurred during an animal's lifetime were passed on to its offspring. This was the theory of acquired characteristics. Lamarck's most famous example was an attempt to explain how the giraffe got its long neck. His story goes like this. The giraffe's long neck allows it to reach plants that other animals can't reach. This improves its chances of finding enough food. The ancestors of the giraffe were smaller animals with shorter necks, rather like the present-day okapi. They could feed only on short bushes, but some of them kept trying to stretch up and reach taller and taller shoots. With all this stretching, their necks became longer. Their offspring inherited the longer necks. When food was scarce, the long-necked giraffes could reach the tall shoots and so survived, while the shorter-necked giraffes starved to death. In 1858, two men, Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin, proposed an alternative theory, the theory of evolution by natural selection. Their reasoning was this. Animals and plants produce many offspring, yet the Earth doesn't become overcrowded. This is because living creatures die for a variety of reasons, lack of food or water. predation. Competition for food. Competition for space, and so on. Animals and plants show variation. Even individuals of the same species are not all exactly alike. These variations are inherited. Because of their different combinations of variations, some individuals are more successful than others. These deer are fighting for the right to mate with the females. Only the winner will get to mate and produce young. The successful stag is said to be fitter than the others because it is his characteristics that are passed on to the next generation. We say that these characteristics have been selected for. Darwin's theory of evolution is based on the idea that there is a struggle for existence. Variations that give a slight advantage in the competition for food and other resources are more likely to get passed to the next generation and so accumulate in a population. A good example of this is found on the islands of Hawaii. The honey creepers which colonized the islands, perhaps blown here by a freak storm thousands of years ago, have evolved many different specializations which allow them to exploit different parts of the Hawaiian environment. Habitats which they could not invade on the mainland because of competition from other animals. This honey creeper is the Pelida. It has a powerful finch-like beak for cracking open seeds. The Akoikoi has a slender beak for feeding on insects and nectar, and a crest of white feathers at the base of its beak. The Iiwi has a long curved bill for probing for nectar in deep flowers. The Akai poluau has a dual-purpose beak. The lower bill is used to chip away bark to find insects, and the finer upper bill winkles them out. When a species evolves into many different new species, this is called adaptive radiation or divergent evolution. It reduces competition and improves the survival chances of the different species, allowing them to colonize new areas. The pressures that lead to evolution, the environmental effects and the struggle for survival, are called natural selection. Similar situations generate similar pressures. For example, this is a South American anteater. Notice its long, narrow snout for probing ant and termite nests. This is an African aardvark. This, the pangolin from Africa and Asia. And this is a marsupial, the echidna or spiny anteater from Australia, all with similar snouts. This is convergent evolution. Another example of convergent evolution is seen in dolphins and sharks. The dolphins, which are mammals, have evolved legless, streamlined bodies to allow them to move swiftly through the water. Very similar to the streamlined bodies of the sharks, which are fish. Not all variations are useful. This wild white rabbit, a colour which occasionally arises through natural variation in the wild, might make an attractive pet, but in its natural home, it's not camouflaged like its brown relations and will easily be spotted by a hawk or a fox. We can see evolution in action today, where changing environments produce new selection pressures. Trees which grow in unpolluted areas become covered in lichens, giving the trunks and twigs a greyish colour. The peppered moth, which rests by day on tree trunks, is well camouflaged against the lichen background. In polluted industrial areas, lichens die, and buildings, walls and tree trunks become covered with a dark layer of soot and dust. Here, the light moths are very conspicuous against the lichen-less, soot-covered trunks. From time to time, a dark form of the moth arises by natural variation. In areas of heavy pollution, the dark form increases in the population, as it's better camouflaged. It is fitter in survival terms. The light moths are easily picked out by birds, so few survive to pass on their characteristics to the next generation. Nowadays, there is less air pollution in industrial areas, so the dark form is becoming rarer and the light form is increasing again. How does evolution give rise to new species? In fact, what are species? Why are these Hawaiian honeycreepers different species and not different varieties of the same species? New species are formed when certain members of a population become so different from the rest that they can no longer reproduce successfully with other members of the population. These Hawaiian honeycreepers have evolved very different coloration, and females of one species are attracted only to males with the right colours. The differences that lead to the formation of new species arise because, from time to time, new variations appear in wild populations of plants and animals. Often, they're at a disadvantage and don't survive to reproduce. Natural selection eliminates them. These are wild budgerigars. They're all green, which camouflages them well in their natural home. Other colours, which occasionally arise from mutations, would stand out against the background and attract predators. In captivity, many different coloured budgerigars have been bred, colours which would not survive in the wild. This is artificial selection, selection by man, not nature. The many varieties of crops, garden plants, dogs, cats, cattle and other domesticated animals have been produced by artificial selection. Evolution depends upon variation. But what causes variation? And how is variation passed on from parent to offspring? Every living cell of an organism's body contains the information needed to make another identical organism. This information is held in coded form in special molecules in the cell's nucleus. These molecules are called deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA for short. They're contained in special structures called chromosomes. DNA is a complex molecule made up of several different kinds of subunits arranged in a special order. The order of these units forms a code which controls the manufacture of the other chemicals in the cell and so determines how an organism develops. This code is called the genetic code. When a cell divides, the DNA in its nucleus makes an exact copy of itself. One copy goes into each new daughter cell. From time to time, a mistake is made in the copying of DNA. This results in a new piece of code. It's called a mutation and produces a new variation. Mutations can also be caused by certain chemicals and by radiation, such as X-rays. These rose varieties have been produced by subjecting the rose seeds to X-rays, so changing the code for petal colour. So DNA and the genetic code provide a mechanism for evolution, a way of producing new forms of life, all contained in tiny chemical threads too small to see. Yet these strange molecules hold the key to all the different organisms that have ever lived on the Earth, and to all the life that exists today and will exist in the future.